Hi everyone, welcome to the August 29th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragone, back with my usual co-host Craig Milkowski. And Craig, happy to have you back on the podcast this week. I know it's been a trying couple of weeks for you, but I'm glad that things are going better with you and your family and that you're able to rejoin for what we have planned this week.
Yeah, I'm glad to be back, hopefully for good this time. We won't have any more delays. The issue I had, one of my family members was really sick, but is doing much better, is back home. So hopefully it stays that way. So looking forward to getting back to doing these shows with you.
Yeah, really happy to hear that news and looking forward to having you with me for the remainder of this week as we do our podcasts and the regular stakes previews, which will be coming up later. So the theme of this podcast, as it always is on the Pacecast, is looking back at last weekend's racing. And it was Travers weekend, so a lot to dissect from that Saturday card, including the Midsummer Derby. There's also racing to look at from some other venues this past week. Charlestown had a big night of racing on Friday. There was a Grade 3 event at Parks. Del Mar out in California had a couple of graded stakes sprints this weekend that we'll dissect, and then we'll finish things up with a couple of maiden races that earned some very nice speed figures, including a surprising one for a 4-year-old gelding at the very end of the show that I know Craig wants to talk about. But Craig, as we shift our focus for now to Saratoga and talk about the action on Saturday, I don't think we can do so without sort of just mentioning the elephant in the room, which of course was the H. Allen Jerkins Memorial and the tragedy on Saturday, and just how that affected watching the rest of the day for not just us, but a lot of fans and people involved in this sport, and just kind of zooming out to look at the entire Saratoga meet and how difficult it's been from multiple angles with some of the tragedies, the issues, feelings around the sport in general, having been accumulated from some of the difficulties that we've had on a series of major racing days this year, and kind of grappling with that when you look at the overall data of breakdowns being reduced across the board, but just seeing them happen on these big days, it's kind of a statistical anomaly, and it's hard to wrap your head around it all and to just soldier on like everything is normal.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, like you said, it's happened on a lot of big days already this year. We just dealt with this a few weeks ago on Whitney Day with Maple Leaf Mel. And it's hard. Like we talked a bit before we started this show, you really look forward to these big days and to seeing the stars. I know most of the people listening to this show are people that love to bet on horses, but we also like the sport and we like to watch the animals run and just see the really good ones. So it was tough, just really tough. It cast a shadow over the rest of the day on Travers Day. It did the same thing on Whitney Day. I mean, to my eye, these were two horses, two 3-year-olds, a filly and a colt, who were running historically fast, and they were both going to win these races easy, and it just really hurts. And I know, we talk about all horses matter. Of course they do. No different than, all people matter. But when they're the difference is everyone knows these horses, and we get to know them. We get to know the stories and the people behind them, and it just makes it really tough to see what happens. And just it's tough when they keep piling on top of each other, which is what seems like it's been happening in 2023.
Yeah, I know. I was just saying that to you before we started that, a lot of what keeps us going in this sport are the star performers and, debating those big races like the Derby and the Preakness and the Belmont and the major races that come after that leading into the Breeders' Cup. And I mean, you can hold in one hand the statistics of breakdowns decreasing across the board on a national level. And, you can praise a lot of the safeguards that have been put in place, especially in California, which is leading the way and doing a great job on a lot of this stuff. But also, it's hard to reconcile that against, having a horse breakdown on Derby Day and Preakness Day and Belmont Day and Whitney Day and Travers Day. And these are the days that, keep you going in this sport, that you look forward to. And, to have this pall cast over what you love, it's hard. And, if you're struggling with it, I mean, know that I'm struggling with it. It's a really difficult thing to process and to sort of absorb and to continue on and be okay with. And, like you were saying, Craig, it happens at all levels. And, we're focusing on, these issues at Saratoga because they happened with the most eyes on them. And they're so high profile, and they're horses that people were fans of and in some cases loved. And that makes it even harder, like it or not. I mean, some horses just, are more in the public eye than others. And those are the situations that really get people talking about change. It's something that I'm sure is going to be debated. There are going to be different issues that come up out of this. This is always the case. And, it's hard to know what the solutions are because, there are so many issues out there in racing that need solving. And of course, safety of the horses and horse welfare is one of them. But, it's difficult to get everybody on the same page with the solution. I tweeted something this morning about just kind of, surveying the current arguments being made for synthetic surfaces, which inevitably is a conversation that's going to come out of this. And, it's kind of, I said something provocative intentionally because, it's kind of hard to argue with the data that, like, we'll see less breakdowns if we run on synthetic surfaces. I mean, that's like, Craig, data, I know data. The data clearly says that. There's no debating that. Sure, there are other ways to go about making the sport safer. And, we've seen great examples in California of, them using different tools in science at their disposal to reduce that risk. But still, I mean, the data is pretty clear on the surface component of it. And, it's tough to sort of, think back on the sport that you fell in love with and all the traditions and how some of those traditions are problematic today. And, opening up your mind to the kind of change that makes you question whether the sport is still going to be the sport that you love into the future is something that's really hard to deal with as a fan of this sport. And I'm sure somebody who participates in the industry and even works with the horses. So that's... I feel like the two times that we've discussed this, I kind of just spill this word salad. But I mean, it's hard to wrap your head around a lot of this stuff, and I think all we can do is just talk about what's on our minds.
Yeah, and I mean, I tweeted a few things or posted whatever they call it these days afterwards, and I kind of do so because I do it from the heart. I know I might look back and maybe think, that's maybe I shouldn't have said that, but a few things I said. You mentioned synthetic tracks. The one that stuck out to me for a while is just racing on these off tracks. It seems like it's a recipe for disaster. I know horses can break down on any track. I mean, I've been following this game a long time and I've seen it, but undoubtedly, you mentioned the numbers on synthetic. On off tracks, horses break down more often than they do on dirt tracks. And I know it would be an inconvenience, but they've taken this into account in California. And when the weather's not going to be good, they cancel ahead of time. And maybe that's a road we need to go down as well, because oftentimes I don't get, we run on these off tracks, we run with small fields and off the turf races and give away ridiculous amounts of money. And it just seems to me the game would be better off if we didn't do that, if we just canceled. And I know it would stink if you were a person who was planning to go to the track that day, but this happens at a lot of outdoor sports, and maybe that's one way to go. So I'm not the biggest fan of synthetic racing, but I'm certainly open to listening. I think I said that in a tweet somewhere in response to somebody. A big part of why I'm not a fan of it is just because we have such a hodgepodge of surfaces now, and it just adds more and more confusion to an already difficult game. But if everybody was running on synthetic, I imagine that part of it would go away. So I'd be willing to listen to anything. I just hope if we do it that we're using the best data, which horse racing doesn't always have. I tend to trust the numbers that we're getting about synthetic and dirt, but I just don't want to run headfirst into anything because that never works, especially in horse racing.
No, and I don't anticipate we're going to be running headfirst into anything. That's not the way we typically do things in this sport. There's a lot of debate, and it's hard to arrive at any consensus about anything enough to move forward in a new direction. But no, I echo a lot of what you said, Craig. I mean, the weather has been a real issue, and it's not Saratoga's fault that they had a historic amount of rain at this meet. It's Mother Nature, and I think horse racing being an outdoor sport, I think, I don't think this is a political thing to say anymore. Maybe it is, but I mean, a lot of people accept that climate change is a thing, and it's something that you have to grapple with because it's not just, warmer temperatures, but also greater precipitation. And it's something that if we're going to continue with the surfaces that we already have, I think we have to come up with some solutions for this. Like you said, maybe some days we shouldn't be running. Sealed racetracks is an issue. Obviously, sealed tracks are not a thing in synthetic racing because the surfaces are built for better drainage and all of that. But we could spend an entire podcast talking about all of this, and I know that's not the goal of this podcast. We want to address how we're feeling because just surveying the sentiment out there and talking to different people, you can kind of feel that what's happened over the past few weeks, it's hit differently, and it's affecting people in a way that I haven't seen it affect fans or participants in this industry in the past. And I think to not acknowledge that would be to be disingenuous with our listeners. Like something's different right now. It feels different. And, not saying we have all the solutions, and we're not even making, this podcast all about this, but it's just, I think it's something that we're going to have to continue talking about, and I hope the conversation that comes out of the way people are feeling right now does continue towards some productive change. So with that, Craig, I think we can move on to talk about some of the actual racing from Saratoga. As far as that Alan Jerkins Memorial was concerned, One in Vermilion was the winner of that race, and in a different way, obviously, you feel for the trainer getting his first Grade 1 victory, in that way. And, the horse is a cool horse, but I feel like it's not a race that we have to really dissect from the standpoint that we usually do. So let's move on to some of the other racing. And obviously the feature race on Saturday, Craig, was the Midsummer Derby, the Grade 1 Travers, and a story that I think a lot of people appreciated getting at the end of that day with Jenna Antonucci training now the Belmont and Travers winner Arcangelo to victories in both of these races. And she did it her way. No race in between, no prep race for this Travers coming off the layoff. And her methods were rewarded here as Arcangelo delivered another strong performance to decisively win this race. And I think cement his status now as the top 3-year-old colt in the land.
Yeah, he looked very good doing it. He's a good horse, and what I really like about him is the way that he runs the turn. It seems like that's when he's able to take command of these races and just keep going all the way to the wire. He's a horse we've been talking about since he broke his maiden. I believe we covered that on one of these Pacecasts. It was an impressive win at Gulfstream Park, and he's done very little wrong since. He just keeps taking steps forward. His speed figures keep getting better, and he's just a really talented one. And it just said it's a good story for me. I obviously don't know Jenna Antonucci. She's doing a great job with this horse. What I take away from it is it's really good to see just somebody different with one of these horses. And we don't get enough of that these days, and I hope we get more of it going forward because we've talked a lot on these shows and on social media about CRWs and stuff, and really on the horseman side, we're basically getting CRWs with the super trainers, and that's why for me it's just super refreshing to see somebody else win these races.
I echo all of those sentiments, Craig, and Jenna Antonucci is just always praised in the aftermath of these races, the owner for, having faith in her and taking a chance when so many wouldn't give somebody like her a chance with a horse like this. So it's a great story, and it's nice to see, that fairy tale continuing for her. And he's just a really cool horse. And beyond all of that, I mean, the pedigree that he has and being his son of Arrogate, and, Arrogate's been a little bit of a late bloomer at stud, but, having lost him early and now, a horse like Arcangelo with this kind of pedigree that could potentially turn into a stallion with the kind of resume that he's developing. I mean, maybe a horse that's going to have a longer lasting impact on the sport. So, I mean, that's it's all really neat. As for some of the others in this Travers, Disarm continues to take a step forward with every start, something that we've seen before from Steve Asmussen runners. I thought he got a great ride from Joel Rosario, sneaking up the rail in this race. He finished well. The disappointment, I suppose, is Forte, who just, got a decent trip. Maybe the pace of this race didn't develop as some people expected, with National Treasure sort of, not really showing any intention of going for the front end, raiding with those blinkers coming off. And I guess maybe that messed up the plans of a few other jockeys. I could see, Jose Ortiz kind of adjusting on Tapit Trice and maybe going to plan B and getting that horse more forward than he otherwise would have been. Not that I'm criticizing Jose. I was happy to see Tapit Trice be given a chance like that. But some that were trying to close maybe didn't get the pace coming back to them the way they expected. But still, Forte was just a little bit dull as the favorite in this race.
Yeah, I thought two horses were disappointing, honestly. Forte won and Mage, who just really had nothing. The Kentucky Derby winner had actually looked pretty good in the Haskell. I guess you could give him some excuses for the start. He was wide, but he was never a factor, so I don't want to factor the trip in too much. He just didn't have much, so I imagine they're going back to the drawing board because something didn't seem right. National Treasure, I just never thought he was very good anyway, whether he went for the lead or not. We've talked about that Preakness. It continues to just disappoint. It's one of the weaker Triple Crown races we've seen in quite a while. So really the disappointments, Forte and Mage. You mentioned Tapit Trace. He ran his best race yet, in my opinion. Got a 123 TimeformUS speed figure. Just not quite as good as the winner and maybe even the runner-up. That one might have just out-tripped them, though. I think they're pretty close.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It was not an ideal trip for Tapit Trice, but at least, he got to be out in the clear and run his race at his own pace, which was kind of what I was hoping with the blinkers and Jose Ortiz going on. At the end of the day, just not quite good enough, as Arcangelo is at the head of this division right now, and that 126 TimeformUS speed figure that he got for this race says that he's the kind of horse that might be able to compete against the older runners later in the season. I would imagine the connections will be planning on training up to the Breeders' Cup Classic. Let's move on to another grade 1 on that Saturday card, the Sword Dancer, and this one was won in a rout, Craig, by Bolshoi Ballet. The other European shipper in this race, as Stone Age, I think, was the one that a lot of people expected to assert dominance over this field, switching into the Chad Brown barn with his resume from last year. But, Bolshoi Ballet is a decent horse. It's kind of flown under the radar at different points, especially earlier this year when he was competing at maybe some lower level races, but running okay in a few of them. And Aidan O'Brien, he had all that success at the end of last year, shipping horses over to the Breeders' Cup with a lot of success. And after, a few seasons there where it felt like he was in a lull with some of his U.S. shippers, he's back on track now because Bolshoi Ballet certainly was better than the American foes that he faced in this race.
Yeah, if you're still clinging to those Aidan O'Brien stats, you've probably been tearing up tickets recently because he's doing everything right when he sends horses here. And Bolshoi Ballet, he wasn't all that impressive. He won the Belmont Derby his first time here, but then disappointed his next 3 starts. But he looked like a totally different horse. He didn't really have grade 1 form coming here, but we see that with many Europeans that come to the States. They're just better than our horses are. He wound up with a 128 TimeformUS speed figure, and I forget who it was, but somebody said that just seemed ridiculously high, but he destroyed this field. And honestly, a 128 is a grade 1 speed figure. It's not like it's a way above par grade 1 speed figure. It's just kind of average. So I have no problem with the number. If you look at the chart in TimeformUS, you will note there are no pace figures. And unfortunately, that's because they did something they've been doing at Saratoga because of all the rain. They ran a setup that they've never ran before. So it just didn't have a baseline for this race and just went with a final time only figure.
You mean a different run-up, Craig? That's interesting.
Yes.
Yeah, that because I know this race was at 0 feet. That's makes it difficult for the figure maker, of course. I mean, as for the speed figure maker of 128, I don't know. It doesn't surprise me. There was 10 lengths between Bolshoi Ballet and the third place finisher in this race, Pioneering Spirit. So, I mean, when you've got that kind of separation, I think you kind of have to expect that, the winner ran pretty well. And clearly he was a horse that handled the yielding conditions. And also, he got a nice ride from John Velasquez. Not that Bolshoi Ballet was ever losing this race, but I liked what Johnny V was saying after the race, that he'd kind of gotten instructions from the connections that this horse is really lazy. And you know what? I had Nick Tamaro on the forecast last week to talk about some of this stuff, and he was making the case for Bolshoi Ballet. I was like, I'm on the same page as you, but my one caveat with him is that he's a really lazy horse. And if you're not, riding him with the last half mile of the race, asking him to go, he's not going to take you there. And it was interesting that John Velasquez, tipped him out into the clear on the backstretch and, got this horse into gear. And he just continued to sustain that run all the way through the wire. That's just the kind of horse that he is. is. Sounds like he's going to come back for another Grade 1, I believe in the Turf Classic at Belmont, and then potentially look on to the Breeders' Cup. I know Aidan O'Brien's, I think, won a Turf Championship before running in some of those top races with a European horse that comes over. So, interesting that Bolshoi Ballet is a new addition to the U.S. turf scene for the rest of the season. The Grade 1 Forgo was the first of the graded stakes races run on this Saturday card at Saratoga, and we had a reversal of fortunes here, Craig, as Elite Power, who I had come on board with you. I wasn't trying to beat him anymore after he won that Vanderbilt, but as soon as you jump on board sometimes, these horses will disappoint you. And, Gunite, this time he had basically the same pace advantage that he enjoyed in the last start, but maybe a slightly uncomfortable trip for Elite Power. And, these horses are not invulnerable, and Gunite was able to get the jump on him this day and hold sway. And the difference in ability between these two has never been so large that a tactical advantage couldn't make the difference.
No, I agree. And it was a race where I actually was tempted to bet Gunite. He was a little bit higher than he wound up going off, and I said, nope, I'm not going to do it. And at 6-5, I'm hardly going to worry about it very much. But it just seemed like eventually the tactics were going to catch up. And this was a race that was really difficult to make a speed figure for. I don't have the worksheet in front of me to remember the specifics, but obviously a big part of it had to do with the pace, which was just crazy slow. Tyler Gaffalione was really able to back down the pace, running a 23 plus quarter, and it was just too much, particularly when Irad Ortiz kind of got in a tough spot with Elite Power, was forced to go down on the inside, something he really hasn't shown he's been able to do. He usually makes that big, wide, sweeping run, and maybe that was it, because he sure didn't seem to have the same kick. It's not like he hasn't overcome slow paces before, so maybe some of it was the trip. I will mention the speed figure is nothing to write home about. Gunite gets a 117. Very tough one to make. This has been an interesting group. They got a big speed figure of 125 last time, but that was with a slow pace upgrade. So I'm still a little bit iffy on these as really top older sprinters.
Yeah, I mean, just on the surface of things, you would expect these two to be more than 4 lengths superior to a horse like High Oak, who was third in this race, but the slow pace just kind of brings everybody else into the race, so you don't get that big separation at the end, like we're going to see in the next race that we talk about, the Ballerina. So yeah, it's hard to gauge the quality of these two, and I don't blame you as a speed figure maker. You don't want to give these horses pace upgrades for 2 consecutive races and sort of artificially inflate their speed figures because we think they're good. We eventually want to see them start to run some faster times with some more legitimate paces. So we'll see if these races get a little bit more competitive towards the end of the season. I mean, it feels like Gunite and Elite Power are kind of generally considered to be head and shoulders above the rest of this division right now, but you want to see them get into a more competitive pace at some point, and we're going to get to the Breeders' Cup Sprint, and you would hope that inevitably in a race like that, there's going to be more pace signed on. So we'll see if that's a truer test for this pair of horses. But right now, seems like a lot of connections are happy to not run against these two. Let's move on to the third of the Grade 1s at 7 furlongs that they ran on this Saturday card at Saratoga. That was the Grade 1 Ballerina, and this race really did deliver, Craig. I mean, we saw a clash of 2 really talented fillies, 2 former champions, and Goodnight Olive and Echo Zulu, and just kind of throw it down and decide it on the racetrack. And they did prove far superior to their competition here, as they drew well clear of the rest of this field. But it was Echo Zulu who has just turned into a new, improved horse as a 4-year-old who was able to put away Goodnight Olive, who, by the way, ran her race and just was simply second best on the day.
She was. I mean, we saw that massive speed figure from Echo Zulu in the honorable miss when she ran a 133. She only gets a 127 here, but it was a 130 final time, so very similar race in my opinion. And she was ridden more tactically, where Goodnight Olive was to her flank. She went only as fast as she had to go to keep the lead, and when she was asked, she started drawing away, and Goodnight Olive was game to finish second. Easily finished second, but Echo Zulu was just pulling away. That 127 speed figure was only 2 points higher than Goodnight Olive with a 125, which matched her career best, by the way, but I think she was probably even more superior than those 2 points would show.
Yeah, I can't argue with any of that. She is just a horse who has taken her game to the next level this season as a 4 year old. Has a lot of early speed, and it has to be noted she did have a significant pace advantage in this race. And I thought that Irad Ortiz did the right thing with Goodnight Olive in trying to keep her honest as much as he could on the front end, because they had been riding Goodnight Olive like more of a closer in her prior races, taking her back and making the one run. And I think Irad did what he had to do, and maybe these were the instructions from Chad Brown to just kind of stay on Echo Zulu's neck the entire way and push her. And it just didn't work out. But I thought they made it a true race, and Echo Zulu was just the better horse on the day. And we'll see what happens in the second half of the season as they move on towards the Breeders' Cup. But Echo Zulu right now looks pretty tough to beat the rest of the way in this division.
Right. And before we move on, I did want to mention part of the trouble with the speed figures was there was rain between these 7 furlong races. The Forgo was obviously run on a fast track. It rained in between before we were able to see Echo Zulu, so couldn't really compare those two directly.
Yeah, rain obviously a theme throughout the entire Saratoga meet, and especially this week, and it was a major factor in the next race we're going to talk about as we move on to Friday's card and talk about the Grade 1 Personal Ensign. And, Craig, I don't mind moving this race to Friday from the Saturday card like it's been in prior years. The Personal Ensign is such an important race in this division, and, it's nice to see it kind of get its own day as it was the feature race on Friday. This Personal Ensign, I feel like the winner, Idiomatic, is a really nice horse. There's no question about that. She was so much the best in that Delaware handicap that she had won in her prior start. However, she had a lot working in her favor this day, and it feels like maybe this wasn't a true test of the relative merits of her, Nest, and Clairiere over a track that maybe wasn't working for some of the other competitors.
Yeah, this was a sloppy track, obviously. Idiomatic was lone speed. We showed it that way on the TimeformUS Pace Projector. I think we haven't even had her picked on top, if memory serves, because of that Pace Projector, which is saying something when you add horses like Nest and Clairiere in here. I don't want to totally dismiss her effort. She ran a good speed figure, a 122, similar to what she's been running before, but obviously, on a fast track, things might play out just a little bit differently. The real disappointment, I guess, was Nest, because she is one that has tactical speed. She wound up finishing third. She wasn't even able to outfinish Secret Oath, who seems to have had a rebirth after a disappointing effort last time out. So good to see her back. But yeah, as far as handicapping these horses going forward, maybe take this result with a grain of salt.
Yeah, it just kind of felt like Clairiere was not handling the track from a long way out. And, Nest really tried, but I mean, for her not to be able to run down Secret Oath at the end, it kind of says maybe she wasn't handling the track so much either. And, there's no color coding for this day in TimeformUS with regard to favoring speed or closers. But personally, for me, watching a lot of the races this day, it did feel like it helped to have forward position over this particular sloppy track. And especially towards the end of the day, it felt like that was really the case. I mean, the last race, a horse just ran off on the front end that, looked like the horse to beat, but that was a really lopsided margin. And, we're going to talk about another race that was speed dominated. But, Idiomatic, no question, as you said, she's a really nice horse. But when you have that double set of factors working for you, a potentially speed favoring track, and a slow pace where nobody's challenging you, it kind of exaggerates the performance a little bit. So I'll be interested to see what happens when these 3 fillies, or really 4, so throwing Secret Oath in too, when they all match up again. Let's talk about the other graded stakes, or actually not graded stakes, but stakes on the Friday card at Saratoga. That was the Smart and Fancy, going 5.5 furlongs for the filly and mare turf sprinters earlier in the day. Craig, roses for Deborah. She's beating the same horses again that she's clearly superior to, so she's not exactly getting tested in these races, but it's the visual, the way that she's winning these races with that exceptional finishing speed over the final eighth or 3/16 of a mile. It says this is a really talented horse that might be able to tackle some bigger goals later in the season.
Yeah, it would be interesting to see. I think if I remember right, you liked her the last time out, even though she came in with speed figures that didn't quite match up to some of the others. And she was able to win easily that day, and she did so here, just in a 4-horse field. The good news is she did at least improve her speed figure again up to a 117. She did it coming from off a pace which was pretty tepid, some of the fractions coated in blue. So I'm really not sure what we have in roses for Deborah. It sure seems like she should be given a challenge against better horses very soon.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of when Caravel made that emergence in the same races, I want to say 2 or 3 years ago at Saratoga, and it took her a couple seasons to ultimately achieve, her optimal results against males and become that Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint winner, but I don't know. Going back and looking at those races, Roses for Deborah feels even more impressive than Caravel was back then. And, maybe these just aren't competitive spots, but Bubble Rock's a decent horse, and she's making her look pretty ordinary, despite the fact that she's had a pace advantage over her in some of these races. So, Roses for Deborah, I've got some faith in her ability to step up against tougher competition, but I'd like to see the connections taken on in potentially a race like the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint later in the season. On Thursday at Saratoga, the feature was the Grade 2 Ballston Spa, and we saw quite an upset here, Craig, as Evie Jets, who was dismissed by the bettors, hit nearly 30-1, was able to get the job done. The trip definitely made a big difference in this outcome, as Manny Franco could not have given this horse a better ride, and Manny Franco really did have a big week at Saratoga this week, I think even a 4-win day at some point. But he gave one of his better rides of the season on Evie Jets, just saving ground every step of the way, and showing that, the wherewithal at the start to realize that Plan A, going to the front end, was not going to be too wise, because there were a couple of horses that were intent on getting to the lead that kind of ran off, and he reined her in immediately, got her to relax, and the horse did the rest. And just really cool to see, a trainer like Matt Cantor-Massey, who claimed this horse, took a risk claiming this horse for 62,500, I think, 2 years ago, and the amount of success that they've had with her, kind of taking down, these multi-horse uncoupled entries from Chad Brown and now multiple stakes races. It's pretty cool. She's a nice horse.
She is, and it's kind of ironic because there was a lot of tooth gnashing, even for me, I believe, when they didn't even try to go to the league last time when she had a different rider in Javier Castellano. Um, but the same tactics work this time, and like you said, it's a function of pace. The same horse who was seeded the league last time, technical analysis, was challenged by a different horse this time, and it made all of the difference. It was a race that we don't have coded in red, but undoubtedly these were pretty fast fractions. Sister Bridget, who was a real long shot, just kind of ran off, and it didn't seem like technical analysis was able to settle down off of the lead. Did eventually take over, but never really looked like a winner. It's an interesting chart when you look at the TimeformUS speed figures, as basically all of the top 7 have very similar speed figures, and it was a very tight margin at the wire between those, but the pace also kind of does that, as some horses got a pace boost, others didn't. So I think if you ran this race 10 times, you might very well get 7 different winners.
Yeah, I don't think Katie Davis is going to be getting any mounts from Chad Brown anytime soon, but that's probably just okay with her. I don't think she was expecting that necessarily. But I mean, no, I love to see it when a horse, shows unexpected speed like that and sort of throws a curveball into the tactics by being more aggressive. I'm never going to criticize that. It makes it a more interesting race. The unlucky one in here was Consumer Spending, who looked like she was getting the perfect trip, reserved off that honest pace and seemed to have a ton of horse at the top of the stretch, and Joel Rosario just could not find a clear path to run. I mean, he tried to go out, went back in, just kept making the wrong moves, and she got, just completely mired in traffic at the end of this race. I don't know if she was going to beat Evie Jets, but she was going to be involved in the finish. Just an unlucky trip through the lane for that one.
Yeah, I mean, she was only beaten a length, so if somebody told me she was going to beat Evie Jets, I wouldn't really have a big argument with that. But that's part of what happens when you save ground. Sometimes it works out, and saving ground is important on turf. But there's always going to be those times where it just doesn't work. And I'm completely with you on Katie Davis. I have no problem with the ride. The horse was 50+1 in here. She has speed, so go on with it. She certainly wasn't going to win the race by sitting mid-pack and trying to out-finish the rest. So if you want to say maybe the horse shouldn't be in the field, I guess I get that argument, though I'm never a fan of that. People should run their horses where they want. Long shots win races all the time, so I have no problem with them taking a shot.
Yeah, and long shots have definitely won races by showing speed in the past when people are not going to respect them in that situation. So I agree with you. We have a similar view on that. The feature race on Wednesday at Saratoga was the John's Call. This one a restricted stakes event going a mile and 5/8 on the turf. And I don't think we need to spend that much time on this one, Craig. Tawny Port showed up. The others, maybe not so much in this race. Maybe some horses weren't handling the course so much, but just a race where it felt like the winner got away and ran a nice race. He was coming out of that Bowling Green where he obviously had taken to the turf, and it's nice to see a horse like this show the versatility to compete up to the same level on the turf that he had been previously on the dirt. But he's one that I don't think would have been a major factor in the Sword Dancer if he had run there. Let's put it that way.
No, I wouldn't think so. I remember him, I think he was a Kentucky Derby alum, if memory serves, but he seems to have taken to the turf. He got a 123 Timeform US speed figure. I use the term speed figure lightly because at these distances over a mile and a half, we basically just do class ratings. It's more about the margins between the horses. So solid effort from him. This was a race restricted to horses that have not won a grade one or grade two this year. I would be very surprised if he becomes a horse that does. This seems more like his class.
Let's wrap up the Saratoga action from this past week by talking about a 2-year-old performance that I know got a lot of people buzzing, and that was on Friday in the 6th race when the Todd Pletcher trained Mike Rapoli homebred Fierceness made his debut, and the word was out on this one, got bet down to even money. I mean, I had watched the workouts leading up to this race, and I was pretty impressed. I mean, this horse had never been asked anything close to his best in the morning, and when they, put the gas down put the pedal down in the afternoon, I mean, he showed a ton of speed. I mean, he got right to the front end, opened up on this field early, and was just in a different league than the rest late. Craig, this is a number we don't often see from 2-year-old debuters.
No, I mean, I think this is a number that was probably better than what we saw in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile last year, if memory serves. Maybe not, maybe just a fraction below. But this was a first-time starter. Got a 116 Timeform US speed figure, won by over 11 lengths. Certainly lived up to the hype. I guess the one caution you have to throw on it is it was done over a muddy track. Always have to be just a little bit wary of big margin, big figure wins on a muddy track. So, something to note, but I do think this is a horse with some real talent.
Yeah, and there were stories about other horses in this race too. I think this could just generally be a productive race moving forward because there were some horses that were maybe a little against the track profile that were prevented from running their best races on this day. The runner-up Era of Defiance is a horse that I know had been working very well coming into this race and had undoubtedly a tougher trip with some issues at the start and taking more kickback coming up the inside. He ran well to be second, but I mean, nobody was in the same league as Fierceness at the end of this race. Like you said, maybe the track helped him a little bit, but this is still a really talented horse. Son of City of Light. There's plenty of speed and precocity on the dam side, so we'll see how far this horse ultimately wants to go, but he is one of the more talented 2-year-olds that we've seen emerge so far this year. I think we can say that with some confidence. Let's move on to Del Mar, where we're just going to talk about a couple of races, both graded stakes events from this past weekend. The Saturday feature was the Pat O'Brien Grade 2 event going 7 furlongs. Nice big field signed on here, Craig. Looked like a competitive race, and Anarchist delivered a nice performance to win here. We had what looked like a fast pace. I obviously haven't seen the TimeformUS chart yet because I don't think the numbers are in there at this point as we're talking about it on Tuesday. But visually, to me, this looked like a race where they were really moving on the front end, and Anarchist arguably might have moved a little soon into that pace to sort of break the race open at the top of the stretch, but credit to him for being able to hold on at the end.
Yeah, it was a really quick pace. Anarchist, he wound up with a 116 Timeform US speed figure, but I think he's probably a little bit better than that when you consider the trip. The pace was fast, the fractions will be coded in red, and he was the one horse who was anywhere near it that was able to do any running. I mean, you can see the 2-3 finishers were way back early, including a very big long shot, Bye Bye Bobby, who ran a decent race, but just had a great setup. I mean, he basically dropped off the screen. He was so far back, looked like he might be eased and was able to get up for second. CZ Rocket just kind of plotted around for third. So I don't want to judge Anarchist too harshly off of that 116 figure. He had run 120s in the past, so I think he's a pretty good one.
Yeah, and I mean, we're talking about Anarchist being, one of the top sprinters out in California and being so clearly the best in this race. And I think we should mention that, he is a horse that shipped east earlier in the year and was easily handled by Elite Power in the True North. So, I mean, maybe that does kind of answer some of the questions that we had posed earlier about where Elite Power and Gunite do stand. But it could also be true that Anarchist, as a 4-year-old, is just a horse that has been continuing to improve throughout this season. I mean, he's been a little bit of a bridesmaid at different points. He settled for second maybe a few more times than his connections would really like, but he could be just a horse that's improving at the right time and maturing now. He certainly ran a game race 2 back against the Chosen Vron, who unfortunately did not compete here, but he was much the best on the day in this Pat O'Brien. And the Sunday feature at Del Mar was the Grade 3 Rancho Bernardo. And the winner of this race, Ida Craig, I mean, she is, it's nice to see a horse like this continue to improve and hold her form over such a long period of time, despite having so many breaks and layoffs in there. This is her 7th victory in a row now, dating all the way back to her 2-year-old season. However, it's been an issue for a number of years now in Southern California, where this older filly and mare sprint division, especially after the retirement of Gamine, just has really been lacking in quality, and it's hard to know where a horse like this really fits in the larger division.
No, I agree. She's only going to get about a 112 Timeform US speed figure. I don't have the official for that yet, but it's basically what she runs, and it kind of tells me where she fits. And she's not really a graded stakes filly. Bob Baffert's placing her well. He's keeping her home where he knows the competition is weak. She's racking up wins, racking up money. Nothing wrong with that at all. But I would be very surprised if she was competitive against better horses back east.
Yeah, I mean, she's a horse that, frankly, I don't recall even talking about on this Pacecast very much, even though she's done all this winning, and it's because we typically, just lop off the lower speed figures when we come up with the stakes rundowns we're going to talk about, and she just has not been running that fast, and I think that continued on Sunday, but she does keep winning these races, and I imagine they're going to look at a race like the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Sprint towards the end of the year, but, I mean, if she had been in that ballerina field, it's hard to imagine her that she would have gotten much of a call in there, so we'll see how they stack up later in the year. But, horses that win like this, they sometimes can develop followings that, can be very dependent on the competition that they faced. Let's move on to Park. So we'll just mention the one race from there that took place, I want to say, on Monday of last week, the Grade 3 Smarty Jones. This was won by Il Miracolo, who is a nice horse, Craig. He competed in the Belmont Stakes, was a good second in the Curlin, earlier on the Saratoga meet, was facing some promising up-and-comers in this Smarty Jones, but I think he used his experience to his advantage here, as he was the one that was actually ready to take the big step forward and beat these foes, despite doing some concerning drifting out through the stretch of this race.
Yeah, it was actually on Tuesday for the record. He was coming out of the Curlin Stakes, ran a decent second to Scotland. He ran a good speed figure that day, and he did so again here, basically matching his speed figure. He went up a few points even to a 121, so good strong effort by him. I don't know about that drifting. That would certainly seem to be a concern. He's a horse who's shown he does have some versatility, so solid horse, but he probably is what we saw here, a Grade 3 type horse. I wouldn't really expect him to jump up. Like, if he showed up in the Pennsylvania Derby, I would imagine he'd struggle a bit.
Yeah, I mean, he's a neat horse. I had actually liked him in the Curlin because I thought he had some of his form coming out of those Triple Crown season prep races was a little better than it looked. He had some subtle trips in a few of those races, but you wonder if there's going to be a ceiling for a horse like this when he steps up against the top 3-year-olds. Charlestown ran their Charlestown Classic night on Friday of this past week, and we could talk about many races from this card, Craig, because there were some pretty notable speed figures in a few of the lesser stakes events, but, we'll narrow it down to some of the top-level horses that, we've already mentioned on this podcast at different points. The winner of the feature race, the Grade 2 Charlestown Classic, was Skippy Longstocking, and I mean, no big surprise that he was the winner. I mean, it was not the strongest Charlestown Classic field that we've ever seen, and he certainly run speed figures that would have made him the horse to beat at different points in the past, but he really had everything go his way from a trip standpoint, Craig, because he's never exactly been a speed horse, but when they let a horse like this who can finish, get to the front end and set a bunch of blue color coded fractions, you're going to have a tough time catching him.
Yeah, and it was one of those races where I'm not sure if you looked at the PPs who really was going to challenge him. It was a race he kind of just laid over the field. Even this, I mean, I didn't bet the race, but maybe 7-5. Particularly when you look at the result, almost looks like a steal. He was able to just go to the front end, walk the dog, win by 5 lengths. He only got a 117 speed figure, but that was knocked down a little from a 122 because of pace. And that's basically what he is, right around a 120 type horse. Pretty good one. And he can collect that big payday for just what was a stroll in the park.
Yeah, his stablemate O'Connor, who was the runner-up in this race, actually ran really well to close from last, despite the fact that there was no pace to set up that kind of run. He's a horse that's been a little frustrating, kind of up and down and inconsistent, but he's got some ability when he has his mind on running. He ran fine for second, but I think you have to say that while also noting that Skippy Longstocking won by 5 lengths, and there was just not a whole lot going on behind him in this race. I mean, Giant Game didn't show up. Doppelganger didn't want to go this far. The Grade 1 Carter winner, Call Me Fast, maybe not the best of trips, but also just a little below his top form. So a race that was not as tough and deep as we've seen the Charlestown Classic come up in some past years. The other graded stakes on this Friday night card was the Charlestown Oaks Grade 3 event for the 3-year-old fillies, and Vava for Cherie DeVoe turning into a really nice, consistent filly who keeps improving. Obviously, she was no match for the tougher field that she faced in the Victory Ride 2 back, but I still thought she put in an honest effort that day to stay on for third, and the slight class relief that she got here really made the difference, but also a great ground-saving ride from John Velasquez.
It was, and ground saving is obviously very important at Charlestown. It's 2 turns around this for the 7 furlongs, so really nice effort from her. She's going to get a 115 Timeform US speed figure. I should mention it was a wet track. Almost all of the day on Friday day and Friday night. But I don't think it affected the results too much. It seems like they did a good job with it. It basically played like a fast track. So Vava's pretty good. This was a grade 3. He probably can't step up and beat better horses at this point, but there is some potential there.
Yeah, undervalued asset who was second in this race was the more fancied of a couple of Chad Brown runners that ran in here, and she got a decent trip, but I mean, she had the more difficult post position, breaking from the far outside in a 10-horse field, and got over as much as she could under Tyler Gaffleone, but you could say that was the difference between first and second in this race. And then we'll discuss one more race from that Charlestown Friday night. I mean, there were some other good performances that we're not going to go through. I mean, Damon's Mound was able to hold on and win a stakes after, contesting a very fast pace. And I think we do want to mention pace a little bit, Craig, with some of these races, because we saw a big difference in pace between a race like that, the one won by Damon's Mound, which had all red color coded TimeformUS pace figures, and the Pink Ribbon, which was won by Society, which, no doubt Society's a really nice filly, but it's now twice in a row that she's had some pretty favorable setups in her races, though she has capitalized on them with some big speed figures.
Yeah, she's pretty good. I believe she won at this track last year and used it as a jumping point to win the cotillion, if I remember right. And she's a good one, but as you said, she's had some really nice trips the last couple. It was a little perplexing. Frank's Rocket, who actually won this race last year as an older horse, didn't challenge more, just kind of was content to let that one go and had no answer once they hit the turn. Society just began pulling away. Ran a 123 TimeformUS speed figure, but what's really notable is the final time figure was a huge 131.
Yeah, she really ran fast in this race, and obviously we have to give it that downgrade due to the fact that she did have that pace advantage trip in here. And, Frank's Rocket, Craig, I mean, I figured out Frank's Rocket before she ran in the honorable miss. She is a really nice horse. She's got a lot of ability, but she will never finish ahead of a horse of similar ability to her. If you look back through her past performances, whenever she runs against a horse that has similar speed figures or within hailing distance and she's not a big favorite, she's going to let that horse beat her. That's just the way Frank's Rockhead is. She's very polite. So that's just, she was not going to beat a horse like Society on this day. And I'll be interested to see what they do with Society for the rest of the year. I know they had briefly kind of mentioned her as a possible for the Ballerina, but obviously, she's going out for Steve Asmussen, who also trains Echo Zulu, and she would have been the one horse that could have been a thorn in the side of Echo Zulu in the Ballerina, so not a big surprise that she didn't show up in that race. But they're going to have to face off at some point later in the season and throw it down on the racetrack because they're running the fastest speed figures of anybody in this division, and they've been doing it using the same running style.
Yeah, the one question I'd have is she did have that success stretching out in one race last year, but I really do think she's a better sprinter, so I personally hope they keep her around the one turn.
Let's move on to a couple more venues that we'll discuss as we close out this show. Both debut performances in maiden special weight races. The first that we'll mention is a 2-year-old performance from Ellis as Awesome Road, who is an expensive $600,000 son of Quality Road, going out for Brad Cox, won his debut. And this horse looks like he could be pretty promising, Craig, and one that should certainly stretch out in distance.
He should. It was a very impressive effort. I kind of was combing Ellis to see what I had missed, and he ran a 108 TimeformUS speed figure, which it's not quite what we saw from Fierceness, but it's pretty good. And he's a horse who Brad Cox doesn't always have them fully crank first time out. They usually leave us something in the tank, so I'm looking forward to seeing his next start.
Yeah, he has a really nice pedigree aside from being by Quality Road. His dam is actually a full sister to Pulpit, that Grade 1 winner, who is also a top sire. So, I mean, there's real pedigree here for this one to pan out and be a good one. Was with the profile of the way we've seen Ellis play, although I didn't go back to on this particular day to check to see if it was particularly speed favoring. But, he did get the right kind of trip in this race, not having to deal with any kickback or anything like that. But that's what you often see from 2-year-olds making their debuts, and I'm sure he'll get more of an education in future starts. But he ran well. The runner-up in this race, I believe his name is Stronghold, he ran well too. Felt like a reasonably strong maiden event from Ellis.
Yeah, and there was a similar one ran just 2 races earlier, and it was way faster, like more than a second and a half quicker. So I don't think the big margin between first and second to third is any fluke. Those are 2 really good horses.
We'll close out this card with a race that I know you wanted to talk about, Craig, one that I would not seen if you had not alerted me to it. That was a Saturday maiden special weight event from Remington Park. I don't know where this horse came from, Craig. Amos Moses Hart. I don't even know what the name means, but I do know he can run really fast.
Yeah, I don't know where that one came from either. It's a little bit concerning that he's a 4-year-old in August just making his debut, but I was not aware of the race, given my personal situation. I've actually been to Remington once this year, but I didn't get to go this weekend. I was doing the speed figures, and this one just kind of got flagged immediately as why is a maiden special weight getting a 123 at Remington. And I went and looked it up and went and watched the race, and it was a really easy card to make speed figures for. All the other ones kind of lined up. The very next race was also run at 5.5 furlongs. I went and checked just to be sure there were no timing issues, and this horse just ran off the screen. Won by well over 15 lengths, was pulling away. And one I'd be very excited to run back. I have no idea where he'll show up. He's actually an Oklahoma bred who ran an open company. I meant to research what the name means. I haven't gotten around to it yet. Maybe somebody can tell us on social media, but just an absolute monster race.
Yeah, I actually Googled the name, and the only thing that came up was the horse. So, I mean, I don't know what it means. I'm sure there's some meaning behind it that we're not privy to. But I mean, this horse, I mean, he busted out of the gate like he had done it 100 times before, like immediately a length in front of the field, and just continued to open up. And you could see at the 8th pole, the jockey kind of, who I'm also not familiar with, I mean, just kind of looked around and was almost like, gosh, this horse doesn't need to run this fast. I better start pulling him up early because this horse is doing a lot in this race. And, I mean, he was legitimately geared down at the end. He probably could have run a couple ticks faster in this race. Really exciting horse. Obviously, it took him a long time to get to the races as a gelding that's already halfway through his 4-year-old season. Not a huge pedigree here by any means, outwork out of a Smarty Jones mare, but boy, is he fast. And like you said, I hope he's one that they can get back to the races soon, because I too would be looking forward to what he could do against winners in the next start.
Yeah, and the jockey Floyd Wethy, he's been a long time Oklahoma jockey. He rides the whole circuit, Will Rogers, Fairmeadows, Tulsa, Remington. I remember a few years ago he got celebrated for 1,000 career wins at Remington. So he's just a good local jockey who's won a ton of races in his career.
Yeah, really interesting, intriguing new horse that I'm sure we'll talk about again on the podcast if he runs back. Well, Craig, that finishes up our recap of this past week in racing. We do have, the rest of our typical schedule on tap for this week. We'll do our stakes previews. I think we've got 3 of them this week for the Daily Racing Form that you can find on our YouTube channel there. And we'll come back for the TimeformUS forecast later in the week. A few different things going on here. We've got Saratoga closing out their meet. I believe Del Mar's got the Pacific Classic coming up. And, there's also Kentucky Downs out there. So we'll see how things come up and what we want to do on the forecast this week. I'm not sure if we'll just default to Saratoga or not. Might be somewhat dependent on me and my schedule, but we'll definitely survey what's out there before deciding on the forecast this week.
Yeah, it should be a good week of racing. I'm really looking forward to the Pacific Classic just to see the 3-year-olds and how they stack up against the older. We haven't seen a lot of that yet, if any, and Go Rocket Ride and one whose name's escaping me, the John Sheriff source, I believe, are going to give
Skinner
it a... Yeah, Skinner going to give it a shot. So that will be good to see how they compare, and haven't been all that impressed with the older horses this year. So good matchup.
Yeah, and whatever Bob Baffert's sending out in this race, he certainly didn't send his best 3-year-olds to Saratoga on Saturday, so maybe he decided to keep them home this year. We'll see what transpires in the Pacific Classic, and we'll obviously do some handicapping, maybe of that and some others later in the week. Everybody, thanks for tuning in to the TimeformUS Pacecast this week. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks for tuning in, and make sure to catch that forecast coming up later in the week.